Good morning, everybody. This presentation is going to be recorded, so we'd like to ask you to silence your cell phones. And time has been allotted at the end of the program to ask questions, so please hold all your questions until then. My name is Mark Whiteclaw. I'm a member of the Chicago Coin Club. And on behalf of the ANA and the Chicago Coin Club, we want to welcome you to the World's Fair of Money in Chicago, or Rosemont, some people say. Our next presenter is Michael Shutterly, I'm sorry. He's going to talk about the golden portraits of Byzantium. Every picture tells a story. Michael T. Shutterly is a recovering lawyer, and I have to ask you about that at some point. And a coin collector and an exhibitor who specializes in Byzantine, medieval, and Roman Republican coinage. He's the author of numerous articles on numismatic subjects, including an award-winning series on Byzantine coins. He is a life member of the ANA, a member of the Association of Dedicated Byzantine Collectors, and other specialty coin clubs, and he is currently secretary of the Richmond Coin Club. He has won Best of Show awards for his exhibits at national and regional coin shows, and before semi-retiring, he was a banking attorney and a regulatory compliance manager, focusing on anti-money laundering and consumer protection laws. Please welcome Michael Shutterly.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. First of all, before I get started, the Golden Portraits of Byzantium is kind of a misnomer. There really was never any such thing as the Byzantine Empire. What it was the medieval portion of the Roman Empire and largely the Eastern portion throughout the Middle Ages. The Byzantine Empire, Byzantium, and that whole stuff started in the 1600s by a bunch of French scholars who didn't like the people that they called Byzantines, and they used it as kind of an insult. But people tend to use it, so that's why I used it in here. What we're going to be talking about today is various coins that depict the various emperors and a couple empresses, and what those portraits actually told. They weren't really focusing on realistic portraiture, they're focusing on other things, and I'm going to talk about those other things. And that's every picture tells a story. The pictures don't really tell you exactly what the emperor or empress looked like, but it does tell you something about what was going on, what they were doing, and what they were like. Okay, the first one here is Anastasius I. He was the first emperor to become emperor after the fall of Rome in 476. He became emperor in 491. The circumstances of his becoming emperor were a little bit unusual. He became emperor because the dowager empress, the widow of the previous emperor, married him and picked him to be the next emperor. That was Ariadne. She was the wife of the previous emperor. She was the mother of the emperor before him, Zeno, and she was also the daughter of the emperor Leo I before him. So she had a lot of influence there. They had no other. She and Zeno had no other children, so she picked Anastasius, who was about 60 at the time he became emperor. All right. If you look at his portrait. The face is really pretty indistinct. You don't really see very much in him. But if you look around everything else, he's wearing a helmet and he's got the shield here on the side, his armor, he's got a spear over his shoulder. His helmet, the beading is very detailed, indicate he was an officer in the Roman army. That's all very clear. What they're basically presenting is this is a military commander, a victorious one. The inscription on the reverse, Victoria Aug, is basically the victory of the emperor. It happens to be plural, victory of the emperors is what they're indicating. The significance of that is that he had nothing to do with the military. Before he became emperor, he was in effect what would have been the secretary of the treasury for the empire. He probably didn't even know how to hold a sword. He's got it pretty much right on it, or hold a spear. He's got it pretty much right on his shoulder, but he would probably, if he were to throw it, he'd probably throw it with the wrong end out. So it was very important for him to show that he was the supreme military commander. That was the primary role of the emperor at that time, to protect the empire, to protect the people, and that's really what this coin portrait is designed to show. And it also shows the linkage to the past, the imperial past. That same coin design goes back about 100 years to the Emperor Honorius, who actually ruled from the west. Who was a child emperor when he became emperor and had no more military experience than Anastasius did. And it was the same kind of thing that was going on then. So it was really part of an ancient tradition to go to that point. Anastasius, he died in 518. He was in his late 80s, and it really took a lot to kill him. He actually died when he was hit by a lightning bolt. He's a very tough old guy. He had no children. Ariadne, the empress who had picked him to be her husband, and the emperor had predeceased him. They never had any children, and he hadn't had any children from before. So there's a question, who's going to be the next emperor? There was a court official by the name of Amantius who decided that he was not going to be emperor, but he would control the empire through somebody else. And he had a stooge named Theodatus, whose name means gift of God. And that what he did is he went to the commander of the imperial guard, a fellow by the name of Justin, and gave Justin a tremendous sum of money and basically told Justin to go and bribe the members of the Senate to pick Theodatus as the next emperor. And Justin did almost exactly what he was asked to do. He did go and bribe the members of the Senate, except that what he did is he bribed them to make Justin the next emperor, and Justin did become emperor. Justin, he was married, but he had no children of his own, and he was already close to 70 when he became emperor. He was in not really great health during most of his reign, but he had the support of his nephew, a guy by the name of Peter, who was very bright, very articulate. Peter had been educated at Justin's expense, and so he pretty much ran the empire during Justin's rule. When Justin realized that death was approaching, he wanted to be sure that Peter would follow him and did everything he could to make for a successful succession. He did not want to have happen what he didn't want anyone else to do what he had done when Anastasius had died. So what he did was he had Peter crowned as his co-emperor. Peter's name changed to Justinian, which means kind of like a younger Justin. And this is the coin that was minted to commemorate the succession, or commemorate Peter becoming co-emperor in April of 527. Now what you see is the two emperors, they're sitting on a throne. Some versions of this coin, there's a little bit of separation in the thrones, but this one you can see it's basically one throne with the two guys. And you look at the faces, there are none. They're basically just blobs, but everything else is very clear. They're both holding orbs, which represent dominion over the earth. The victory of the empires is on the reverse. What this basically shows that the empire is going to continue, and it's going to continue with these guys. Even if one of them's dead, the other one's still going to be around. And it worked. Justin died 4 months later. Justinian became emperor by himself, sole emperor, and everything went well for about 38 years. When Justinian became emperor, he started doing a new kind of a portrait. This is a little bit more, you can see the face, but it's not really a very distinctive face. It's kind of, to be honest, I could draw a portrait of someone that would look every bit as good as that, and it just doesn't look like a person that much. But he's not really trying to show himself as Justinian the man. This is Justinian the emperor. He's got that in the older coins and the older artwork, the archaic smile, that's kind of very faint little smile. He's not really focusing on things of the world. He's like kind of looking up to, he's not actually, the eyes aren't up, but he's basically looking up towards heaven. He's focusing on more important things than the everyday life of everybody else. And that's really what this particular portrait is designed to show. But this is done intentionally. It's not because they couldn't do portraiture. If you go around at this time, this is one of the mosaic portraits from Ravenna, the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. Justinian, one of the big things that he did was he led or ordered the reconquest of Italy, brought it back into the empire for at least a few hundred years. That's a very distinctive portrait. If you saw that guy on the street, you would probably recognize him. So they still, and that's very difficult to do, a mosaic portrait. Those little tiny stones. But they still had the art of portraiture going on. So the coin portraits, the lack of detail in the coin portraits is not because they couldn't do portraits, it's because they chose not to do regular portraits, and this is what you came up with. When Justinian died in 565, he was followed by his nephew, Justin II. Justin did a pretty decent job for the first few years of his reign, but then he lost a major battle and he basically went crazy. The stories are that he used to ride around in his palace in a chariot, barking like a dog, throwing things at people. Not really a good image for your emperor. Towards the end of his reign, he was persuaded to nominate someone to succeed him. He nominated Tiberius. 10 days later, he died, and Tiberius became emperor. Tiberius was a successful general, but he wasn't very healthy. After 4 years, he died, but had nominated Maurice, Mauricios, who was actually, it's a Greek name, nominated him to be emperor. And Mauricios changed his name to Maurice Tiberius, the more Latin form. in honor of Tiberius before him. Now, if you notice, all three of those portraits are pretty much the same, very similar, especially the first two. You can barely tell the difference between them. The third one's a little bit different, but again, it has that same vague expression on the face, the faint little smile. They were kind of, this is basically they wear peas in a pod here. It's a continuity. What they're trying to show is the continuity, that things just didn't change. The man who was the emperor might die, but the emperor was eternal. He would not die. And so you go from one to the other, and this continues to go forward. Maurice was generally successful during his reign until the very end. He was one of the better generals of the empire, but in the last couple of years, things started to go bad with some additional invasions coming through. And the Avars, they came down through the Balkans, and they managed to capture a Roman army, about 10,000 soldiers, which they wanted to do the routine thing. We capture these guys, just pay us a ransom, we'll go back to where we came from, everything will be okay. Maurice kind of adopted the policy of no negotiation with terrorists. So he basically said, we're not paying anything. So the Avars said, fine, we'll just kill these guys, then we'll go back to where we came from. And they basically killed that entire Roman army of 10,000 soldiers. That was not really good for the morale of the remaining soldiers of the Roman Empire. So there was a military revolt against him, and he was deposed. And he was replaced by this guy, Phocas. There's a little bit more detail in Phocas's portrait, and you'll notice he has a beard. He was the first emperor to have a beard in several hundred years, and every emperor as an adult after him would be portrayed with a beard, all the way to the very end of the empire for the next 800 and some years. He was a self-made guy. When he took over, he was a centurion in the Roman army, the Eastern Roman army, which is equivalent pretty much to what we would call a captain in our modern armies. So not a really high rank, but he obviously had some kind of leadership skills because he was able to, take over. He reigned for about 8 years, which is basically described as a very horrible time. The things he liked to do was like hold people over smoky fires by their ankles and kind of basically get what he could out of them. And his wife is described as having been even worse than he was. In fact, that's the primary description, is she was worse than Phocas. So that was not a good time. That eventually led to a revolt. And Heraclius became emperor. Heraclius was the son of basically the governor in Carthage. He sailed over to Constantinople with his own army, took over. It was a very quick fight. And in 610, he became emperor. It was actually kind of a remarkable achievement by him because he was a brilliant general, but he was a little bit nutso as some of the others were. He was afraid of water. When he was leading armies across rivers, they had to sort of do a pontoon-type bridge and throw a lot of dirt on it and raise a couple trees because he didn't want to be able to see the water on either side of the bridge. So for him to sail from Carthage, which is in North Africa, towards the west, all the way over to Constantinople, which is all the way to the east, was a real achievement. I suspect he was probably below decks most of the time. In 612, he had a son born right about then, 610, 611, 612, the date isn't really absolutely certain, who was Heraclius Constantine, which actually gets to be a problem with Byzantine coins, is that his dynasty, everybody was Heraclius or Constantine or Heraclius Constantine or Constantine Heraclius. So you see the coins, and sometimes you can't really tell from the inscriptions who it was. So people have to use like die studies to try and get them in sequence and figure which guy is actually being portrayed. But what he is doing is kind of similar to what Justin I had done 100 years earlier. He's got his son, who was only about a year old at the time, put him on the coins so that when the time comes, it'll be a very smooth succession. And I mentioned that he was only about a year old at the time. That is not the portrait of a one-year-old boy. That's a portrait of probably someone in his maybe about 12, maybe 15 years old, somewhere in that time frame. Again, the objective was not to portray him accurately, realistically. The objective was to portray the new emperor or the next emperor who'd be coming up. Heraclius, his wife died, and then he remarried. As it happens, he remarried his niece, which is not really a smart thing to do in those days. And he had a son by the second marriage, Heraclius, who is also another one of these Heraclius, Constantines, and the rest of them. And he decided that he was going to add the second son to the coins as well. And so you get, with this portrait, coin is showing the three of them together, the father and the two sons. That coin is sometimes known as the Three Kings portrait, or the Three Kings coin. Heraclius, the father, is there in the center, the older son there on the right, the younger son there on the left, on our left. And you see each one of them is holding a globus cruciger. It's got the cross on the globe. They knew the world was round. That's basically showing dominion of the world, which they're holding in their hands. And the cross kind of signifies that the whole empire, it's a Christian empire, so everybody is below the rule of Christ, ultimately. And the inscription, it continues with the Victoria Augusti on the reverse, again indicating multiple emperors. But again, the faces, Heraclius himself, his face is pretty distinctive there, with the very long whiskers, wide whiskers going across there. But again, not really, you would not recognize, well, you would recognize that because it's kind of a very odd, bizarre-looking portrait, but it's not really a realistic portrait of an individual. Again, it's just basically showing, this is a dynasty that's going to live and will continue. Heraclius died in 641, and he was succeeded by his two sons, Heraclius Constantine and Heraclius. It didn't really work out very well. Heraclius Constantine, the older son, was probably tuberculosis. He died basically 100 days later, leaving Heraclius, the younger son, who was about 15, as sole emperor. One of the reasons it didn't work out well is because Heraclius had married Heraclius' mother. She was his niece. That was something that really disturbed a lot of people at the time, incest and all like that. And she was also apparently not a very nice person to begin with. And of course, as a good mother, she wanted to make sure that everything was clear for her son, who was, rather than her stepson, because Heraclius Constantine would have been her stepson. So she did everything she could to kind of pave the way for her son, but that antagonized a lot of people, including the supporters of the older son of Heraclius. So after a few weeks, Heraclius was forced to name his nephew, the son of Heraclius Constantine, as his co-emperor, and that didn't go out very well for him because about 10 days later, Heraclius and his mother were both deposed, sent off to they had these islands available to put people into exile after they cut off their tongues, and they just sent them off to the remote islands, and that was the end of this portion of the dynasty. However, it did continue with the son, Constantine II, who was the son of, or Constans II, but it was Constantine. But in order to try and make a distinction, we try and, historically, they've called him Constans. And that's also his son, Constantine IV. Constans was only about 10 years old at the time, but this coin comes from later in his reign, about several years later. You notice the very long beard. Constantine IV, his son, is sometimes called Constantine Pogonatus, which means Constantine the bearded one, but it turns out that's a mistake in some of the early records. The real reference to Pogonatus was the father, who's the one on the left, and you can see why he's called, all those lines coming down, that's not drapery, that's a beard that goes all the way down to the bottom of the portrait. You can see the clasp on his robe on his right shoulder on the far left. But the rest of those vertical lines, most of them, the ones in the center, are a beard. And he's got the big mustache that Heraclius had worn. But again, he's doing the same kind of thing here with bringing his son, who was a very young man at the time that particular coin design came out, to show, again, this dynasty is going to continue, and there's not supposed to be any argument about who comes next. There actually was a little bit of an argument. Constans was very unpopular for a lot of reasons. He had sort of moved over to Syracuse. The Arabs were then attacking the empire on all fronts, and he decided he had a more central position where he could fight the wars all around the Mediterranean that were going on. One of his attendants murdered him in his bath using basically a soap dish, to the extent that they actually had soap at that time. And so he dies, and Constantine IV, who was 16 years old at the time, he becomes emperor. There was a brief interregnum where someone else came in there for a few months to rule as emperor, but he didn't last very long. Constantine IV, although he was only 16 years old, it turns out he was another one of the brilliant general emperors, so he put down what amounted to the revolt in the matter of just a couple weeks, and basically reigned pretty much very securely for the next 17 years. Now, Constans, the father, He had two more sons after Constantine IV, and he puts them on the back of the coins. There's not enough room, basically. He expected that Constantine IV would be his real successor, but the others were there. It's kind of the heir and the spare and the extra spare heir all together there. Again, you can see Constance's beard is even more prominent on this one. It's pretty much covering almost this entire front. The faces are still kind of like vaguish, but the important point here is that, this is the dynasty that will continue. You can knock one off, you can knock two off, you can knock three off, but there's still going to be someone who's going to be there going forward in the next generation. And again, continuing with the inscription on their reverse, the victory of the emperors, and now it is truly a whole lot of emperors coming on there. Anyway, as I said, Constans gets murdered in 668, leaving Constantine IV as emperor, and he's got his two brothers still on the reverse of the coin. He didn't have any children at that time. Now, if you notice that portrait, it's kind of similar to the one that we saw a little before with Anastasius, sword on shoulder, helmet, and all the rest. The portrait, it looks like, it's almost, the face is almost kind of a Picasso kind of thing. The eyes are uneven, the nose is kind of like odd, the mouth is odd, but that's what they want to do. But basically, the emperor is as the military commander, and the two potential heirs, if needed, are there to take over as needed. There was a real problem, though. Constantine was not a very trusting individual. After a few years, this coin is dated 668 to 681, he ruled until 685. During those last 4 years, Tiberius and Heraclius were off on one of those islands, and it was just Constantine by himself. He just got rid of them. And although he did have a son, Justinian, also named Justinian as the previous Justinian, he never put Justinian on his coins, at least not on the gold coins. He was just there by himself. This portrait is actually a better one than the one on the previous coin. You get a little bit more detail in the face, so he is kind of a little more individualized. He is kind of trying to show a little bit more that he's the guy, but still, it's not really a great picture of an individual. But the military accoutrements, the sword, the breastplate, the shield there on the left, very small on the left, the helmet, the beading on the helmet, the tuft on the helmet, all that basically proclaims that this is the military guy, he's the commander, don't mess with me. Constantine dies in 685, fairly young man, he was only in his mid-30s. He's followed by his son Justinian II. Portraits change completely here. Justinian is there on the right, which is the reverse. The obverse side, that is intended to be a portrait of Jesus. In the inscription, Jesus is the King of Kings, and Justinian is the servant of Christ, is the inscription on the reverse. Justinian, he was a very pious man. He was a little nutso, like some of the others. There's a strain of insanity in that family. But he was a very pious kind of guy. And for the first time, Jesus appears as a portrait on the obverse side of a coin. There are a couple others that were kind of hinted at on the reverse sides of coins for doing blessings and so on. But here you have an unmistakable portrait. And that's actually a more individualized looking portrait than is typical of Byzantine coins at the time. That's actually a real face there. That's the Christ Pantocrator, which is Christ, the ruler of all, the Lord of all. There's some question or debate as to what was the reason for it, why Justinian happened to do that at the time he did it. He reigned from 685 to 695 in his first reign, but these coins came around towards the end, around 692, 693. And there are a couple theories about why he happened to do it at that time. One is that he had called a religious conference that only bishops from the Eastern Empire showed up for. The people in the West, none of the bishops showed up for it. And it got into one of those disputes between the Patriarch in Constantinople and the Pope in Rome. And they came up with a decree that said that Jesus had to be portrayed as a person, not as the Lamb of God or the other symbolic representations. In the West, they still preferred the Lamb of God and those kinds of representations. So the theory is that Justinian did this to basically poke a finger at the Pope and say, we're going to do it our way. The council ruled, you didn't show up, that's your problem. And they did this. The Pope responded by starting the hymn Agnus Dei, which is the Lamb of God, which is still part of and the Catholic Church is still part of the regular ceremonies, although in English rather than Latin in the United States. And the other theory about it is that by this time, all of North Africa was ruled by the Arab Muslims, and all the papyrus that the Byzantine Empire used came from there. And the Byzantine Empire was a very bureaucratic regime, so they used a lot of papyrus, but the only source was the Arab Muslims. And when they bought it from the Muslims, they were always stamped with the Ismaillah, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, which was kind of offensive to them because the Byzantines had to clip off. So there's a lot of waste of the stuff because they weren't going to have that on their imperial decrees and so on. So as it happened, the Arabs were still using Byzantine gold coins in their economy. So this might have been intended as a poke in the eye of the Arab Caliph, and that's why they did that. The Arab Caliph responded by creating Arabic gold coins that just had the Arabic inscriptions, including "There is no God but Allah" and "Muhammad is the prophet of Allah." So it didn't really work out well for Justinian. It also didn't work out well for Justinian because he was nutso, and he was overthrown in a revolt in 695. They cut off his nose and they cut off part of his tongue and sent him off into exile in Cherson, which is on the Crimea, on the Black Sea, pretty far away from Constantinople, to get him out of the way. That's Justinian on the left getting his nose cut off, or actually his tongue at that point. The guy on the right is Philippicus, who was one of the guys who followed Justinian over the next 10 years. He was getting blinded. They didn't cut off his tongue or his nose, they just cut off his eyes, took out his eyes. The reason for cutting off the nose and the tongue is because the emperor was supposed to be flawless, physically perfect. He couldn't have anything wrong with him. And by removing his nose and his eye and his tongue, he was no longer perfect. He was no longer eligible to be emperor. So you just send him off into exile, and you didn't have to worry about him coming back. The only problem is it didn't work. Justinian did come back after 10 years. He managed to raise an army with the Bulgarians. He had trouble besieging Constantinople because no one could ever take Constantinople. But it turned out there was an open sewer pipe that he knew about because he had lived there all his life. He goes in with a few men through the sewer pipes, and he takes over, and he becomes the emperor the second time. And now he's ruling again. He's got the portrait of Jesus on the reverse, on the obverse, and it's a different portrait. This is considered to be a younger person, a younger version of Jesus. The previous one was more of a European look for Jesus. This is one is more of a Middle Eastern look, or at least towards the eastern part of the empire, and that might have to do with the fact that when Justinian was exiled, he was in the far eastern part of the empire when he was in exile, and so he might have been influenced by that. The reverse is Justinian, shown on the left, and his own son Tiberius on the right. He is known at that point as Justinian Rhodometus, which means the slit nose, which his nose was slit. In 711, he spent most of his reign, the second reign, killing people. Anybody who had been involved with the previous regimes, there were two emperors in between while he was in exile. Anyone involved with them got killed. Anyone who might have been involved with them got killed. Anyone who looked like someone who might have been involved with them got killed. Eventually, people got a little tired of that, and so he was overthrown. There was several minor emperors over the next few years, and then finally Leo III, the Isaurian from Isauria, became emperor. And he became emperor in about 717, and then about 3 years later he started putting his son Constantine V on his coins. Again, these are basically characters in terms of the portraits, but once again it's the emperor and his son, the heir, on the other side. Copronymus is an interesting name. Apparently what it means is kind of like named after poop. The word poop is not exactly what they use. It's a little bit more informal. But what happened was when he was being baptized in the Orthodox Church, when you're baptized, you're dropped into the water 3 times. And apparently during one of the droppings into the water, he dropped something else in the water. And that's how the monks who hated him gave him the nickname Copronymus. But again, this is the emperor on the left, the heir on the right, and we're going to have a new dynasty. A few years, this went on for about 21 years. Leo dies, Constantine becomes emperor in his sole right. He was only about 16. There seems to be this thing with the new emperors coming in. They're only 16 years old, each one. Leo's best friend and associate was a guy named Artavasdes, who basically seized the throne at that point. He was married to one of Leo's daughters, which meant that he was Constantine's brother-in-law, even though he was old enough to be Constantine's father. He just kind of took over, but he didn't do anything about Constantine. Constantine just basically escaped from Constantinople. He goes to the other side of the Bosporus Strait. He spends a year building up an army. He comes back and he takes the throne, and he becomes emperor. And what he does is what I've referred to as a dynasty of the living and the dead. This is a new coin that comes up during his reign that for a while people were kind of uncertain as to what it was. I actually have the pictures reversed. I'm just learning how to use Photoshop and everything else. The one on the right is the obverse and the one on the left is the reverse. The one on the right is Constantine himself, Constantine V. The one on the left is his father Leo, who was dead at that time. He's showing the continuity, but he's showing it backwards. That I'm not just some guy like the guy who tried to overthrow me last year. I am the emperor. I'm legitimate. Look, my father was emperor, so here I am. So that's what he's showing on this coin. And basically the left one, the inscription identifies Leo as Leo the father, and it's Constantine. Constantine had his own son, Leo IV. So now this one is right. Constantine and Leo IV, the son, are on the left, on the obverse, and Leo III, who is deceased, is on the right. So basically, you've got the heir on one side and the predecessor on the other. You've got the whole dynasty on this coin at this point. And Leo is now the grandfather of the youngest one. And now this is Leo on the right, on the left side coin, the obverse. That's Leo on the right and the father, Constantine, on the left, our left, but their right. Their right as they're looking at us, and that's the prominent position. So it's always where you've got two on there. The one who's on our left, their right, is always the more prominent one. He's shown there with a beard, as mentioned before. All the adult emperors were always shown bearded. But Constantine, we know from historical records, was beardless. He was clean-shaven during his entire reign. And the monks hated him for that because they thought that an adult man should always be bearded. But the convention was that the emperor has a beard, so by God, he's going to be shown with a beard. Again, it has nothing to do with what he really looked like. It's just to show him. And you see the two portraits are very similar, other than the beard and the fact that one's a little larger than the other, which is a convention. The senior emperor is always shown larger than the younger one. Well, Constantine dies, and then Leo, his son, becomes emperor. Leo IV is the leading emperor. Leo happened to have a son at that time, who was also a Constantine. This is just the Heraclian dynasty. Everybody's Heraclius or Constantine. This dynasty, everyone is Leo or Constantine. Leo IV, the senior emperor, Constantine VI, his son, are shown side by side on the left, and then Leo III, the founder, and Constantine V are shown on the right. Again, it's the dynastic continuity. They're showing everybody that they can on these coins. So this is a dynasty that has a future as well as a past. No one had ever done this kind of thing before, but they're going, by gosh, they're going to do it. Well, Leo IV died fairly young. He was only after about 4 or 5 years. And so Constantine becomes the senior emperor at the age of about 6 or 7. He was very young. He didn't even make it to 16 the way the rest of them did. So he has, of course, being as young as he is, someone's got to be a regent for him. And mom, his mother, Irene, is the regent. So now we get the coins with, there's Irene and Constantine on the left, and then Leo IV, his father, or Constantine V, his grandfather, and Leo III, his great-grandfather, all there on the right. Very crowded together on a very crowded little tiny throne, but mom and Constantine are there on the left. At this point, Irene is willing to let Constantine hold a senior position. Again, the senior one is there on the right, on our left, but they're right, and she's taking the kind of subordinate position on what looks like our right side. And this went on kind of off and on. They had some disputes between them, but at one point Constantine actually booted her out, Irene out, took control of himself, but he was still a bit of a mama's boy. He let her come back in. But for 17 years, this is kind of the general way they were being portrayed. But this is obviously going to be a problem. Like, what happens when Constantine has a son, then presumably, the son goes in there with him and Irene, or maybe replaces Irene, but then what happens when Constantine does? Then how many more people can get onto these coins before it becomes really unwieldy? This is already unwieldy. So, Irene actually found a solution for it. She basically deposed Constantine, possibly killed him, but there's debate about that. There's some stories that show Constantine was alive for the next few reigns, but blinded and someplace else. Other stories are that he was blinded, and in the blinding he was killed. But it's really uncertain either way. But now we have the reign of Irene and Irene. She's on both sides of the coin, which hadn't been done before. She's really showing that she is the top gun here. She was the first woman to actually rule the empire in her own right. There would have been obviously a lot of times when there was an empress of some sort who was kind of the power behind the throne, but she was the throne. There was no power behind the throne. It was her. And it even shows in the title, on the left one and on the right, it's Irene Basilissa, which is Irene the Queen, which is considered to be as important as Empress. But she, on the coins in Constantinople, she did not call herself the Empress. She called herself the Queen. Before her, every Empress had been either the mother, the daughter, the sister, the wife, the niece, the aunt of an emperor who had real power, the official power. She was kind of making a break from all that. So she's the only one on the coins, and she ruled fairly decently for 5 years, but she was not as effective as she would have wanted to be. She ended up having to spend an awful lot of money on what amounted to bribes to people to kind of keep the people happy, and kind of like bankrupted the treasury. And so it ended up kind of not well for her. She was deposed, sent off to an island, and then died a few years later. They didn't mess her up, cut off any body parts. They just sent her off to the island, and where she died just a year or two after being deposed. This is the Invisible Man. Constantine VII was the son of Leo VI. He was he was a child when he became emperor, had to have a regent, and there were several regents. His mother was one. Romanus Lecapenus became the regent eventually. Romanus was a very effective guy, very strong ruler. He was an admiral in the Byzantine navy. He ends up kind of gradually getting more and more control. He becomes emperor himself. He ultimately named his own son, Christopher, as his co-emperor, later on named 2 other sons as co-emperors as well. This coin, Constantine VII, is the official emperor. He's not on this coin at all. He's not mentioned. He's nothing. He's completely gone. That coin portrays Romanus on our left and Christopher on our right. And the inscription identifies Romanus and Christopher. There's no reference at all to Constantine. He's basically completely in the background now. And he stayed in the background for a number of years. The obverse portrait is Jesus. They've gotten back to putting Christ on the coins, which is the important thing, is the obverse, obviously. But anyway, this state of affairs lasted for about 10 years. 931, Christopher dies, and Romanus decides to put Constantine back on the coins, so Constantine did come back. A few years later, Romanus's other sons, they deposed Romanus, sent him off to one of those islands. The people of Constantinople were concerned that there was a threat against Constantine. They really loved Constantine. He was a very popular guy. He used to walk through the streets doing pictures of people. And they were afraid that he was going to be hurt. So then there was a revolt against the 2 sons. The sons were then sent off to an island, and then Constantine became sole emperor, later named his own son, who happened to be named Romanus because he was married to Romanus's daughter. And then he reigned happily ever after. This one is a puzzling coin. Again, it's Jesus on the left and the Emperor Constantine IX on the right. There are a couple things here. It's not entirely distinct, but they're on our right side of the coin on the right. Constantine he's got his hand on the hilt of a sword, and then on either side of his portrait there are stars. And there's always been question for years as to what is the meaning of that, because they don't have a whole lot of stars showing up on Byzantine coins. They show up all the time on Roman coins, but not as often on the Byzantines. And so the question is, why? There are a couple theories about that. One is that we know pretty sure that these came out about 1054, based upon the dye studies and links. And in 1054, as it happens, the Crab Nebula exploded. It was a supernova, exploded in the sky, and it was actually visible in daylight for months. And it's even still visible at night. So that's one theory, is that, well, these came out in 1054, the nebula is 1054, must be the same thing. Problem with that is that there's no record, no Byzantine record that even refers to it, nothing. There are American Indian records, Native Americans that show like pictures and things which are clearly intended to show it. There are records, written records from China and Japan and a few other places that refer to it, but the Byzantines never did. They kind of made observations about everything, but they never mentioned it. So the question is why would they have put this on a coin if it's something that otherwise they didn't even care about? A second thought is that, well, 1054 is the year that the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Eastern and Western churches separated permanently, and they've remained separate since then. The difficulty with saying that's what it is that the popes and the patriarchs have been bickering for about 500 years at that point. So, why would they have decided, how would they have known that this was going to be the permanent one? It actually was pretty permanent because it wasn't until about 1965 that the Pope and the Patriarch retracted those excommunications. Not that it really did a whole lot of good for the popes and the Patriarch who had already been dead for 900 years, but it was, it's a thought that counts. But it's kind of difficult to suggest that that's what it really was. Now, one thing that had happened very early in Constantine's reign is that there was a big military revolt against him when he first became emperor, because he basically became emperor because the daughter of a previous emperor had married him and decided he was going to be the new emperor. But the revolt was put down with two big battles in different parts of the empire. So that's a third theory, which does actually make a bit more sense. The two stars representing the two battles, and his hand on the sword, his military prowess, even though he had nothing to do with it. He's another civilian like Anastasius was 500 years before. But that's probably a more likely explanation for it. At this time, in 1054, 1055, the empire was really being troubled by the Normans, who had taken over their possessions in Italy, and the military position was really lousy. So this might have been just a propaganda move. Like, okay, things aren't too cool right now, but I managed this before, I'll manage it again. But he died before everything fell apart completely. This is Constantine and his wife Zoe, the one who made him emperor in the first place. It's an interesting portrait because that is a pretty lively portrait of him. You can see they could still do portraits. This is from about 1050 or so. And the portrait is interesting because that's not his body. That's his face, but not his body. He's the one, of course, on the left, Jesus in the middle. And what they're doing is they're endowing a church. Zoe had been married several times. Her first husband, Romanus, was picked for her by her father, the Emperor Constantine VIII. And they were not really a happy couple because Romanus was forced to put his wife into a convent monastery in order to marry her. He was given the option, you can do that or I'll just cut your eyes out and put her in a monastery anyway. So he chose the lesser of two evils and married Zoe. Zoe didn't really like him very much. After about 6 years, she murdered him or had him murdered in his bath, probably not with a soap dish, but murdered in his bath. And the next day, she married Michael, her second husband, and they were pretty happy together. And then Michael dies and she marries Constantine. Well, that portrait was originally supposed to be Romanus, her first husband. When she married Constantine, they scraped off the portion of the portrait that showed Romanus and just put in Constantine's face. There's a little bit of an interregnum there, but then Isaac I Comnenus, who was member of one of the important Byzantine families, he becomes emperor. This is, again, Jesus on the left. On the reverse side, on the right, is Isaac. He's gone beyond just putting his hand on a sword or showing himself in armor. He's got that sword out, it's on his shoulder, and he's ready to go and cut down anybody he needs to. This was very significant because he was basically showing that his power came from the army. He was one of the very successful generals up to that point, and he's just showing where he comes from. It's the military that he stands on, and by gosh, you better know it. And he did. Unfortunately, the other civilian powers were still very powerful in Constantinople, and so after 2 years, he was deposed, went off to a monastery. They had stopped cutting off body parts by then, so he just went off to the monastery and sulked for a few years, and then died. This is the last gold coin of the Byzantine Empire. It's John V Palaeologus and John VI Cantacuzenius. Again, John was like 5 years old when he became emperor, so this whole regency thing gets all screwed up. John VI was one of the guys who came in to try and help out. Now you look at this, and I mentioned before that they didn't try for realistic portraits, and I kind of like defy you to find a portrait anywhere in this mess. This is one of the Johns, this is a John, and this is Jesus, who's basically like blessing or crowning the two of them. There was a civil war that went on between them, actually several civil wars between them, with the older John VI trying to take complete power, but then backing off because the dynasty was still very popular. So John V would come back, and they'll go back and forth on this. But here they're united. But you can't even tell that that's a portrait anymore. What's going on? Well, this is a time period where just war after war after war. The empire was basically becoming bankrupt by then. It was during his reign, John V, in order to keep power, he ended up ultimately having to pawn the imperial regalia and the jewels. They had no crown or anything like that after that point. It was nothing. The only reason it's continued to survive is that other people would support it, like the Turks, who would had their own little battles going on with each other. He could get one faction in the Ottoman Turkish government to support him and basically leverage him against the other. And this is the period when the Byzantines become really Byzantine. They're surviving because they're good diplomats. They're not surviving because they're strong militarily. And then we have the very last one, which is not golden because this was the last gold coin. The very last coin of the Byzantine Empire. This is Constantine XI. He was a member of the Paleologus dynasty. There were no known coins for Constantine until about 1974, when a small hoard turned up, and these are the kinds of coins that were in there. The left side is the portrait of Jesus, the right side is Constantine. It looks to me like basically a bunch of dots and dashes, a Morse code portrait. It probably looks to you the same way. These were probably done during the last siege of Constantinople. The Ottoman Turks, under the Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, had besieged Constantinople. He had an army about 80,000. The total population of Constantinople was about 50,000 at the time, with 5,000 fighting men, about half of whom were mercenaries that they were trying to get in. The silver for these coins probably came from church, like chalices and things that were melted down to make coins. They were just in a rush. That siege lasted for about 6 weeks until the Turks took over. So they were rushed to try and get this stuff done. So you can see it's kind of like no one really cared what it looked like at this point. What this tells you is nothing about Constantine himself, but it tells you that the empire basically was being flushed down the toilet at that point. It's really kind of sad, but it's also, it's a very historical kind of thing to do. It does look like the portrait on the left, the Jesus portrait, just have a little bit more going for it. They are focusing more there, but really neither one is a true portrait of anything other than this is the death of an empire, and that is the death of the empire. And this is actually what Constantine looked like, Constantine XI, the last Byzantine emperor. Again, you could sort of probably recognize that face if you saw him on the street, but it doesn't look anything at all like that. And that is my talk. Questions? Any questions? Yes, Simca?
Most of the portraits of Jesus had his hand in a special symbol, and that was also on the mosaic.
It's a blessing. It's part of the blessing.
Okay.
And it actually gets significant in the modern orthodoxy about using 2 fingers versus 3 fingers to do a sign of the cross, which actually is done backwards. 2 fingers is the duality. Jesus is God and man. 3 fingers is the Trinity. So all those things that they do in those portraits, there's some significance behind it. Yes, ma'am.
One of the first coins you showed, they had the angel walking with the...
No. That was not an angel.
Victory.
That was the goddess of victory, Nike.
Victory walking with the staff that looked like the Cairo. But
Yeah.
The Cairo was reversed. I was wondering if there's any significance.
I don't know of any significance to that, but that was kind of a little bit odd, the way that was done, because they were a Christian empire and had been Christian for over 200 years then, but they were still using the pagan goddesses. It was then that Justin was the first one. Under Justin, the angel, the goddess of victory became an angel. They actually changed the sex. It's kind of hard to tell, but if you look at it carefully, the angel is male, but the goddess obviously was female. The robes were a little bit different.
Why are some of the Byzantine coins, particularly the older ones, why are they cup-shaped?
Well, that's actually the later ones that they were doing that. That was about the 11th century that started. There's a lot of theories about it. One is that it actually makes them easier to stack them. And it's kind of odd because it's very hard to do that. It wasn't until about the 1990s that anyone actually figured out how it was done. It's a very complex process to make it work. It may have been to stack them somehow. It does make the images on one side very clear, the images on the other not very clear. It could have been just to kind of make the inside and the images in the cup are clear. It might have been just they wanted to make sure that that showed up, recognizing that otherwise the people couldn't even see what it was. Yes?
In the portrait of Irene, she has the title of Basileus, and you translated that as queen. Is that a military term?
No, it really means queen. Basileus was a king, which is the Greek. That's the Greek terms. That was the other thing that she did, was she used Greek rather than Latin that had been used before then. But yeah, it purely means queen. It's just the female equivalent of king. Yes.
Yeah, the one that had the emperor with his father, I believe it was Leo was his father.
Mm-hmm.
How did they decide that was not the father ruling with the son on it? Was it something in the legends? Or?
There were, it's mostly comes about because of like hoard type stuff. When you find those coins, they all show up at a later date after Leo the Third, the father, after he had died, is when you start to see those things. Some of them, on later times, they'll say like Leo the father, Constantine the son. So those are clear, and then you link those with the link those coins to the ones coming out of the hoards, and it's pretty clear that that was the actual progression. But it took a long time to really figure that out. If you go through some of the old books and things, catalogs, you'll see they'll be identified as coins of Leo the Third rather than Constantine, because no one ever done that before. Yeah, there's no record that says here's what we're going to do going forward.
One more question.
Yes.
You mentioned in your discussion of Justinian in the late 7th century that there was the designs particularly depicting Christ as a man as opposed to a lamb, and then the response of Muslim societies to Christians removing their holy figures from the coins. Could you elaborate a little bit on the sort of back and forth of those different design changes?
Okay.
Sectarian tensions that existed?
Oh, sure. That was a big thing. Is that Justinian? He was the one who was ultimately thrown off the throne in 711 after the second time. He was the one who had done the thing with the Christ images. That didn't come back for several generations later. But 6 years after he was deposed, Leo comes in, and Leo was from a far eastern part, the most eastern area of the empire, right on the border with the Islamic. The Caliphate, and the caliphs at that time, and the Muslims in general, there was no portraiture of anything, much less a portrait of God. And Leo seems to have kind of picked up on that, and that was very common in that portion of the empire, is to avoid no portraits at all, nothing, no depictions at all of the holy. A lot of times they didn't have any portraits of people if they could help it. And he seems to have just picked up on that, and then decided that this is the reason why the Muslims are doing so well against us, is they're not breaking the second, depends upon your Bible, the first, second, or third commandment, the commandment that prohibits graven images. The Muslims were faithful to that, even though that comes out of the original Old Testament, the Jewish portion of the Bible. They were faithful to that decree of God, not to portray the Almighty. Therefore, that was what must be why they were successful, and we keep failing. So we take those things off, and they stayed off. Irene actually is the one who restored them. One of the things that she did, so she's actually a saint in the Orthodox Church because she restored the images after almost a century of not having those at all. Yes.
Well, thank you. Michael, thank you so much for your presentation. On behalf of the American Numismatic Association, we would like to present you with a certificate with your name and the title of your program for today.
Oh, thank you.
And then on behalf of the Chicago Coin Club, we'd like to present you with this speaker's medal with your name engraved on the back of it.
Thank you very much.
We hope you wear that proudly.
I shall. Thank you
Thank you
very
so
much.
much.